The winter of 1894 shall forever remain etched in my memory as one of peculiar malevolence, when the very air of London seemed to conspire against its inhabitants with a viciousness that defied natural explanation. The Thames had frozen to such a depth that enterprising vendors had established booths upon its surface. The fog that typically shrouded our great metropolis had been replaced by a crystalline clarity that rendered the gas lamps sharp as diamonds against the snow-laden streets. It was during this season of extraordinary cold that one of the most perplexing cases ever to grace our chambers at 221B Baker Street presented itself in a manner as dramatic as it was disturbing. I had returned to my old lodgings at Holmes's urgent summons, my wife Mary having departed to tend to her ailing mother in the countryside. His telegram had been characteristically terse. "Watson, winter breeds unnatural crimes. Your presence essential. Come at once. S.H." Such communications had never failed to stir my blood, and despite the bitter weather, I had made haste to Baker Street with that familiar thrill of anticipation that accompanied the promise of adventure. On the evening in question, I sat before our familiar hearth, watching my friend as he lay stretched upon the sofa in that peculiar attitude of repose which I had learned to recognize as the prelude to intense mental activity. For 3 days, Holmes had been in one of his contemplative moods, speaking little and consuming even less. Mrs. Hudson had complained to me privately that he had refused every meal, subsisting entirely upon tobacco and the occasional cup of black coffee. His long, spare frame was wrapped in his mouse-colored dressing gown, and his keen gray eyes were fixed upon the ceiling with an intensity that suggested he was reading some invisible text written there. "The criminal classes have grown disappointingly prosaic of late, Watson," he murmured suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "The newspapers report nothing but crude burglaries and sordid domestic tragedies. My mind craves the intricate, the impossible, the puzzle that laughs in the face of ordinary logic." "Surely the peace is to be welcomed," I ventured, though I knew such sentiment would fall upon deaf ears. "Peace is stagnation," he retorted, springing to his feet with that sudden burst of energy that always caught me unawares. "I require stimulation, Watson. The game, as they say, is—" His words were interrupted by a commotion below. Not the measured rap of Inspector Lestrade or the timid knock of a distressed housemaid, but a frantic, desperate hammering that seemed to shake the very foundations of our lodging-house. Holmes's eyes blazed with sudden interest. "Ah," he exclaimed, moving swiftly to the window, "unless I'm much mistaken, Watson, our period of enforced idleness is about to come to an abrupt end. Observe the rhythm of those blows. Desperation combined with physical exhaustion. Note also the irregular intervals. Our visitor pauses between each series of knocks, as if gathering strength or courage." Mrs. Hudson's voice could be heard from below, followed by heavy, stumbling footsteps upon our 17 steps. When our landlady burst through the door without her customary knock, her face was flushed with concern and no small measure of alarm. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she gasped, "there's a gentleman below in such a dreadful state. He can barely stand for the cold and the shaking, and he insists he must see you immediately. Says it's a matter of life and death, and I do believe him, sirs. The poor man looks as if he's seen a ghost." "Show him up at once, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes commanded, his lethargy vanishing entirely. "And bring brandy, the finest we have. Watson, prepare yourself. I suspect we are about to encounter something quite outside the ordinary run of criminal enterprise." The figure who appeared in our doorway moments later was indeed a sight to inspire both pity and wonder. He was a man of perhaps 40 years, well dressed in the manner of a professional gentleman, yet his appearance was so extraordinary that I found myself questioning the evidence of my own eyes. His evening clothes, though of excellent quality, hung upon him in sodden rags. But it was not mere dampness that had reduced him to such a state. It was ice. Despite the fact that the temperature outside hovered well above freezing, and our sitting room was warm with the glow of a generous fire, The man's eyebrows and mustache were crusted with white rime. His skin bore the mottled blue pallor of severe exposure, and when he moved, his clothing crackled with the sound of frozen fabric. Most disturbing of all was the expression in his eyes, a mixture of terror and bewilderment that spoke of some experience beyond ordinary human comprehension. "Brandy, quickly," I commanded, moving to assist the stranger to the chair nearest the fire. His sleeve was stiff to the touch, the fabric frozen solid despite the warmth of our room. Holmes positioned himself before our visitor, his sharp features alive with scientific curiosity. "You have traveled here from Kensington," he observed, his voice calm and measured. "Specifically, from the vicinity of the High Street. You are a professional man, a solicitor, I should say, from the ink stains upon your fingers and the particular wear pattern on your right cuff. You lodge in a boarding establishment rather than maintaining your own household, and you have spent the better part of this evening in conditions that would not be out of place in the Arctic regions." Our visitor's eyes widened in astonishment, and what little color had begun to return to his cheeks fled entirely. "Good God," he whispered, his voice hoarse with cold and shock. "How can you possibly know these things? Are you some manner of spiritualist?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Nothing supernatural, I assure you. The clay upon your boots is of a peculiar reddish hue found only in the construction works currently disrupting the roadway near Kensington Church. The quality of your evening dress speaks to professional status, while the specific staining patterns on your fingers indicate regular use of legal documents and contracts. Your lodging situation is evident from the economical cut of your garments, well made but not bespoke, and the absence of personal effects about your person. As for the Arctic conditions—" Holmes paused, his eyes glittering with interest. "That, sir, is precisely what I hope you will explain to us." The stranger accepted the brandy I pressed upon him with trembling hands, drinking deeply before attempting to speak. "My name is Arthur Pendleton," he managed at last. "I am indeed a solicitor with chambers in Lincoln's Inn. I lodge at a boarding house called the Rookery, a respectable establishment, though modest in its appointments." "And tonight?" Holmes prompted gently. Pendleton drew a shuddering breath. "Tonight, Mr. Holmes, I retired to my room at approximately 9 o'clock. It was a perfectly ordinary evening, cool, as befits the season, but nothing unusual. I locked my door, lit the gas lamp, and prepared for bed. Then—" He paused, his hands trembling so violently that brandy sloshed from his glass. "Then the cold began." "Began?" I interjected. "You mean the temperature dropped?" "No, doctor. The cold did not creep in. It fell upon the room like a physical blow. In the space of perhaps 30 seconds, the very air became so frigid that my breath formed clouds of vapor. The water in my wash basin froze solid. I heard the ceramic crack with the expansion of ice. When I attempted to relight the gas lamp, the flame guttered and died instantly, as if the air itself had become too thin to support combustion." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes burning with intense interest. "You are certain the window was secure?" "Latched tight, sir. I checked it myself when the cold began. The door was locked from the inside, and there is no fireplace in the room, only a small coal brazier which had been burning cheerfully until that moment." "And the hallway beyond your door?" "Perfectly warm, Mr. Holmes. When I finally managed to force the door open, the handle had become so cold it burned my palm like a red-hot iron. The corridor was at its normal temperature. But when I looked back—" Pendleton's voice dropped to a whisper. "The door to my room was covered in hoarfrost on the outside, and through the keyhole I could see that everything within had been transformed into a winter landscape." Holmes began to pace before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic pose which indicated deep thought. "Most singular," he murmured. "A locked room mystery, but one where the intruder is not a person, but the elements themselves, defying the very laws of thermodynamics." He turned to face our client, and I saw in his expression that fierce joy which always accompanied the presentation of a truly challenging puzzle. "Mr. Pendleton, You are in no condition to return to your lodgings tonight. You shall take my bed, and Watson will attend to your medical needs. But tomorrow, at first light, we shall journey to Kensington. I find myself possessed of a burning desire to examine this room of yours, this chamber that can apparently summon the depths of winter while the rest of the world sleeps in comparative warmth." As if in response to his words, a gust of wind rattled our windows, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the midnight hour. The sound seemed to carry with it an ominous quality, as if the very night itself were warning us of the strange and terrible mystery that awaited our investigation. "Tell me, Mr. Pendleton," Holmes said quietly, "in all your time at the Rookery, have you ever heard tell of the previous occupant of your room?" Our client's face went ashen. "Why do you ask, Mr. Holmes?" "Because," my friend replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've begun to suspect that your icebound lodger may not be entirely unknown to the establishment, and that his presence may be far from accidental." The morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, though nothing approaching the supernatural frigidity that Mr. Pendleton had described. I found our client much recovered after a night's rest in Holmes's bed, though he remained pale and spoke little during breakfast. Holmes was in excellent spirits, consuming a hearty meal with an appetite that demonstrated his renewed interest in the case. He had spent the early hours consulting various reference works and dispatching telegrams to contacts whose identities he did not share with me. "You observe, Watson, that the barometer remains unchanged and the weather mild for the season," Holmes remarked, studying the frost patterns on our window. "Whatever befell Mr. Pendleton last night was not the work of ordinary meteorological forces." "Then what do you suspect?" I inquired, though I knew better than to expect a premature revelation. "Human agency, my dear fellow? The question is not whether, but how and why." He turned to our client with renewed intensity. "Mr. Pendleton, you mentioned yesterday that your room had a previous occupant. I require every detail you can provide about this individual." By 9:30, we had secured a hansom and were rattling through the frozen streets toward Kensington. Holmes maintained an inscrutable silence throughout the journey, his mind doubtless arranging the sparse facts into coherent patterns. The Rookery proved to be a substantial 3-story building of red brick, respectable without being elegant. Precisely the sort of establishment that would attract professional men of modest means. Our knock was answered by a formidable woman of middle years, whose iron-grey hair was pulled back severely, and whose sharp eyes immediately fixed upon Pendleton with concern. "Mr. Pendleton, we have been most worried about you, sir. You disappeared so suddenly last evening." Her gaze shifted to Holmes and myself with curiosity. "Mrs. Marchmont, may I present Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson?" Pendleton replied. "They have kindly agreed to investigate last night's extraordinary circumstances." The effect of Holmes's name was immediate. Her stern expression softened into reverence as she stepped back to admit us. "Mr. Holmes, what an honor, sir. I shall assist you in any way possible." Holmes wasted no time on pleasantries. "Mrs. Marchmont, I must ask about the previous occupant of room 7. Has this room always borne that number?" The landlady's face underwent a remarkable transformation. Color drained from her cheeks, and her hands twisted nervously in her apron. "Why do you ask such a thing, Mr. Holmes?" "Because I suspect room 7 has a history you have concealed, a history directly relevant to last night's events." For a long moment, Mrs. Marchmont stood frozen, her internal struggle visible. Finally, she sighed deeply and gestured for us to be seated. "You are quite right, Mr. Holmes. Room 7 was formerly room 3 until I had the rooms renumbered 5 years ago. I thought perhaps a change might dispel certain unfortunate associations." She paused, gathering courage. "The room has always been troublesome. Previous tenants left suddenly, complaining of unusual cold and strange sensations." "And before these recent difficulties?" Holmes prompted. Mrs. Marchmont's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. 8 years ago, the room was occupied by Edmund Carstairs, a quiet clerk in a shipping firm. One morning in January, during a harsh winter, my housemaid found him dead in his bed. The physician said heart failure, but she hesitated. Mr. Holmes, when they discovered him, the room was like an ice house. The windows were frozen shut from the inside, frost covered the walls, and Mr. Carstairs' body was frozen solid, though he had been alive and well the previous evening. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with intense interest. "Was there an inquest?" "Yes, sir. The coroner ruled death by natural causes, aggravated by severe weather, but those who saw that room knew better. There was something unnatural about it, something that defied explanation. And yet you continued to let the room." Mrs. Marchmont drew herself up with dignity. "I am not wealthy, Mr. Holmes. I cannot afford to leave rooms empty based on superstitious fears. I had it thoroughly cleaned, changed its number, and said nothing to subsequent tenants. Until last night, I believed the matter was behind us." Holmes rose abruptly. "Then let us waste no more time. Take us to room 7, Mrs. Marchmont. I have theories forming, but they require examination of the physical evidence." As we ascended the creaking staircase, the air grew perceptibly cooler. By the second landing, our breath misted visibly. Even in the dim gaslight, the anomaly was unmistakable. The door to room 7 was outlined by a rim of white frost, as if winter itself had marked its territory in this otherwise temperate house. Holmes stood motionless before the frost-encrusted door, his keen grey eyes studying the crystalline formations with the intensity of a natural philosopher examining a rare specimen. The ice crystals decorated the wooden panels in intricate patterns that seemed to radiate outward from the keyhole and the narrow gap beneath the door, suggesting that the source of this extraordinary cold originated from within the chamber itself. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, withdrawing his magnifying lens. "These formations are not random. Note how the crystal growth follows distinct directional patterns, heaviest near the floor and around the lock mechanism. In nature, frost typically spreads in irregular, fern-like fractals, but here we see evidence of rapid, uniform cooling, almost as if the cold were being forced through these openings under pressure." Mrs. Marchmont produced the key with trembling hands, her face pale with apprehension. "I have not dared enter since Mr. Pendleton fled last evening, sir. The very thought of what lies beyond that door fills me with dread." Holmes accepted the key and inserted it into the frozen lock. The mechanism resisted stubbornly, the metal stiff with cold, but with a sharp twist and a sound like cracking glass, it yielded. As the door swung inward, a wall of frigid air rushed past us with such violence that Mrs. Marchmont gasped and retreated down the corridor. The temperature differential was extraordinary. It felt as though we had opened a portal to some Arctic wasteland rather than a modest lodging room in the heart of London. The scene within defied both reason and the natural order. Every surface gleamed with a coating of ice so thick and uniform that it transformed the humble chamber into a crystalline palace. The wash basin, as Pendleton had described, was cracked and frozen solid, the water having expanded with such force that the ceramic had shattered, leaving jagged fragments embedded in a solid disk of blue-white ice. The bedclothes lay stiff as boards, covered in hoarfrost that sparkled in the pale winter light filtering through windows obscured by elaborate frost patterns. Most peculiar of all was the small coal brazier in the corner. Its contents were frozen in mid-combustion, the coals encased in ice yet retaining their shape as if time itself had stopped at the moment of the temperature's catastrophic drop. The very air seemed thick and crystalline, each breath forming dense clouds of vapor that hung motionless in the stillness. Holmes stepped into the room without hesitation, though I observed him pull his coat tighter and don his gloves. "Do not touch any surface with bare skin, Watson," he warned sharply. "The thermal conductivity is severe enough to cause immediate tissue damage." He moved with methodical precision, first examining the windows with minute care. "The frames are intact and properly sealed," he announced. "No hidden vents or passages. The putty shows no signs of recent disturbance, and the ice has formed over the latches from the inside, proving conclusively that these windows have not been opened since the temperature dropped. Moving to the walls, he ran his hands along the baseboards and tested the floorboards with careful pressure. Near the bed, he paused, kneeling to examine a particular section of flooring with his lens. "Most instructive," he murmured. "Watson, observe this discoloration beside the bed. The frost is thinner here, and the boards show slight warping, as though subjected to repeated cycles of moisture and rapid drying." I knelt beside him, noting the subtle but unmistakable evidence. "It suggests this phenomenon has occurred before." "Precisely. And note the position, directly where a man's feet might rest when rising from bed." He chipped away a small sample of ice with his penknife, holding it to the light. "This is not merely frozen condensation. There are chemical traces here. Ammonia, certainly, but mixed with something less common, something metallic and sharp." Rising, he turned his attention to the gas fixture mounted on the wall, examining it with particular care. The brass fitting was encased in ice, but Holmes studied the connection points and the small pipe that fed the flame. "The gas supply appears normal, yet—" He paused, his expression growing more intent. "There are tool marks here. Recent ones, though cleverly concealed." "You suspect tampering?" I asked. "I suspect ingenuity of the most malevolent sort," he replied. He then examined the small coal brazier, dismantling its components with swift efficiency. Peering into the narrow tin pipe that vented into the wall, he scraped a sample of residue from the interior rim, depositing it into a glass envelope from his waistcoat. "Mrs. Marchmont," he called without turning. "Who occupies the room directly below this one?" "That would be Mr. Silas Vane, sir," she replied from the safety of the corridor, her voice trembling. "He is a retired chemist, a very quiet gentleman who keeps to himself. He's been with us for nearly 6 months and maintains his room quite warm, even in the coldest weather." "A chemist," Holmes repeated, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "How remarkably convenient. And has Mr. Vane shown any particular interest in the building's construction or ventilation systems?" Mrs. Marchmont hesitated. "Well, now that you mention it, sir, he did ask several questions when he first arrived about the flue system and the gas connections. He said it was merely professional curiosity, having worked with such things in his career." Holmes moved to the center of the room, his head tilted slightly as he sampled the air with the delicacy of a wine connoisseur. The chemical scent was faint but unmistakable. Ammonia masked by coal dust and old wool, but with an underlying metallic sharpness that spoke of industrial processes. In the wardrobe, forcing open the frozen doors, he discovered Mr. Pendleton's suits hanging like rigid sentinels. But it was not the clothing that captured his attention. It was a small dead spider curled in the back corner, its legs drawn tight, frozen into a tiny black pebble. "Observe this creature, Watson," he said, lifting it carefully with his tweezers. It was not caught in a web, but was fleeing, seeking the deepest, most insulated part of the room. Yet it was overtaken instantly. This confirms that the thermal drop was not gradual, but catastrophic, occurring in mere seconds. As we prepared to leave the frozen chamber, Holmes paused at the threshold, his hand resting thoughtfully on the doorframe. "One final question, Mrs. Marchmont. You mentioned that Mr. Carstairs, the previous victim, died 8 years ago. Was the room below occupied at that time?" "Why, yes, sir, by a young student from the university, a bright lad, always tinkering with mechanical devices. But he left quite suddenly after the tragedy. Said the place had become too melancholy for his studies." Holmes's eyes narrowed with interest. "Indeed. And this student, do you recall his name or his particular field of study?" "I believe his name was Hartwell, sir. He was studying chemistry and natural philosophy. Quite brilliant from what I understood, though rather eccentric in his experiments." As Mrs. Marchmont closed and locked the door behind us, sealing away that impossible winter, Holmes stood in contemplative silence. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in his remarkable mind, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. "We have learned much, Watson," he said finally, "though the method remains ingeniously concealed. We are dealing with a mind of considerable scientific knowledge and ruthless determination. The question now is whether Mr. Vane and the mysterious student Hartwell are one and the same, and if so, what drove him to perfect such a deadly and unnatural weapon." The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was indeed afoot, but this game involved forces that seemed to mock the very laws of nature themselves. Holmes wasted no time in directing our attention to the floor immediately below the frozen chamber. The contrast in temperature was immediately apparent as we descended the staircase. The oppressive chill of the upper corridor gave way to an almost tropical warmth that seemed to emanate from behind the door marked with a simple brass 3. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, kneeling to examine the carpet beneath our feet. "The fibers here show distinct heat damage. Scorching that suggests intense thermal activity has passed this way repeatedly. Note also the faint discoloration of the skirting board, consistent with superheated air moving under pressure." Mrs. Marchmont hesitated before the door. "Mr. Vane is a quiet gentleman, sir. He keeps very much to himself and maintains his room quite warm due to his poor health." Holmes's sharp rap upon the panel was answered by shuffling footsteps and the sound of a bolt being drawn. The door opened cautiously, revealing a gaunt man of perhaps 50 years, his pale eyes magnified behind thick spectacles. Despite his apparent frailty, I noticed his grip upon the door handle was remarkably steady. "Mr. Silas Vane?" Holmes inquired with studied courtesy. "I am he," came the reply, his voice cultured but wary. "How may I assist you?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We are investigating the extraordinary events in the room above yours. Might we step inside?" Vane's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A slight tightening around the eyes, a momentary hesitation before stepping aside. "Of course, though I fear my humble quarters offer little of interest to such distinguished visitors." The room beyond was stifling, the air thick with chemical vapors barely masked by pipe tobacco. What should have been a modest lodging had been transformed into something resembling a laboratory. Glass apparatus lined makeshift shelves, rubber tubing snaked between various containers, and beside the blazing fireplace stood an arrangement of metal cylinders and valves that spoke of serious scientific endeavor. Holmes moved through the space with predatory grace, his keen eyes cataloging every detail. "You maintain your quarters at an elevated temperature, Mr. Vane, far beyond what comfort would require." "Poor circulation," Vane replied quickly. "A consequence of my years in cold laboratories. I find warmth essential to my well-being." "Indeed. And this apparatus?" Holmes indicated the complex arrangement by the fire. "Sophisticated equipment for a retired gentleman's hobby." "Experiments in gas compression," Vane answered, though sweat had begun to bead upon his forehead despite his claimed need for warmth. "Purely academic interests to occupy my retirement." Holmes knelt beside the apparatus, examining the connections with minute care. "These valves are designed to withstand enormous pressure. The metal shows wear patterns consistent with repeated use under extreme conditions, and this tubing—" He lifted a length of rubber piping, noting the micro-fractures along its surface. "Exposure to severe cold. Despite the tropical conditions, you maintain her." "I sometimes store materials by the window," Vane said, his voice growing tight. "The winter nights have been harsh." "Not harsh enough to damage vulcanized rubber in this manner," Holmes replied softly. His gaze moved to the ceiling, fixing upon a point that would correspond precisely to the frozen area above. "Tell me, Mr. Vane, have you had occasion to examine the ventilation system that connects these floors?" The question struck home. Vane's hands gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles whitening. "I have no interest in the building's infrastructure." Holmes rose, his expression growing more intense. "I took the liberty this morning of making certain inquiries. The university registrar's office provided fascinating information about a student named Marcus Hartwell, who lodged in this very room 8 years ago, expelled for conducting dangerous experiments involving rapid thermal transitions. Vane's composure cracked visibly. For a moment, raw anguish flickered across his features before he mastered himself. Many students have lodged here over the years. True. But the records also mention that Marcus Hartwell had a younger brother, Silas, who served as his assistant in various chemical enterprises. After Marcus's disappearance following the death of Edmund Carstairs, Silas also vanished from public record, until appearing 6 months ago under his own name, taking lodgings in his brother's former room. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Finally, Vane seemed to deflate, sinking deeper into his chair with the air of a man who has carried an unbearable burden for too long. "Yes," he whispered. "Marcus was my brother, but I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I had nothing to do with last night's incident. I came here seeking to understand what he had done, to find some way to prevent such tragedy from occurring again." Holmes remained standing, his posture rigid with suspicion. "Then you will explain the purpose of your apparatus and why you have taken such elaborate measures to conceal your identity." Vane looked up, and I saw in his expression not guilt, but profound grief. "My brother was brilliant, Mr. Holmes, but his genius was matched by fatal recklessness. He discovered a method of creating instantaneous phase transitions, transforming thermal energy through cascade reactions involving compressed gases. He believed it would revolutionize refrigeration." "But Edmund Carstairs died," Holmes said quietly. "The guilt destroyed Marcus. He fled London and died 2 years later, broken by remorse. I came here to understand his work, to find a way to neutralize the effect forever." Vane's voice cracked. "The apparatus you see represents my attempts to recreate his experiments under controlled conditions." Holmes studied him intently. "A noble sentiment, Mr. Vane. But if you did not cause last night's incident, then someone else possesses intimate knowledge of your brother's deadly discovery. And I fear Mr. Pendleton's escape may prove temporary unless we identify this new threat with utmost haste." Holmes examined Vane's apparatus with renewed intensity, his keen eyes tracing the network of brass fittings and rubber tubing that comprised this makeshift laboratory. The stifling heat of the room seemed to press against us as he knelt beside the compression chamber, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to ordinary observation. "This lock mechanism on your writing desk, Mr. Vane," Holmes said without looking up from his examination. "The brass shows wear patterns, inconsistent with your key. Someone has opened this drawer recently, someone with a broader instrument, perhaps a skeleton key or duplicate." Vane's face went pale as he moved to the desk and examined the lock with trembling fingers. "Impossible. I keep the only key on my person at all times." He paused, his expression growing more troubled. "Though there was an incident last month. I returned from the British Museum to find my room had been disturbed. Nothing appeared missing, so I attributed it to an interrupted burglary attempt. Or a successful theft of information rather than objects," Holmes replied grimly. He rose from his examination of the apparatus, his expression grave. "Your brother's notebooks. I assume you possess them? What remains of them?" Vane moved to a locked cabinet and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and covered in dense scientific notation. Several pages were missing when I retrieved Marcus's effects. Specifically, the detailed schematics for the activation mechanism. Holmes seized upon the journal with barely concealed eagerness, his eyes scanning the technical diagrams with remarkable speed. "Ammonia under extreme compression," he murmured, translating the scientific notation. "Rapid expansion through a series of catalytic chambers creates what your brother termed a thermal cascade. The heat is not merely removed from the environment, but actually annihilated through an endothermic reaction of extraordinary violence. The process requires precise timing," Vane explained, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. Marcus discovered that the reaction could be triggered remotely through harmonic resonance, a specific sound frequency that would shatter a fragile glass seal within the mechanism, releasing the catalyst. Holmes looked up sharply from the journal. A sound trigger? What manner of frequency? He experimented with various tones, but found that the deep resonance of church bells provided the most reliable activation. The low-frequency vibrations could penetrate walls and activate the mechanism from a considerable distance. Church bells. Holmes repeated thoughtfully. Mr. Pendleton reported that the cold began suddenly at 9 o'clock. The bells of St. Mary Abbot's chime precisely at that hour. He began pacing the small room, his mind clearly racing through the implications. But who possesses this knowledge? Who had access to the missing pages? There was a colleague from Cambridge, Vane said reluctantly, a man who visited Marcus shortly before his death, claiming interest in thermodynamic research. He called himself Corvus, though I suspected even then it was a pseudonym. Describe him. Tall, dark-featured, with a pronounced limp in his left leg. He wore gloves constantly, even in warm weather, unusual for a gentleman of apparent breeding. Holmes struck his hands together with sudden recognition. Julian Thorne, I should have seen it. Immediately. The gloves to conceal chemical burns, the limp from a laboratory accident involving cryogenic materials. He was dismissed from Cambridge 3 years ago for conducting dangerous experiments that nearly killed 2 students. Thorne was Marcus's rival, Vane whispered. They competed for the same fellowship, the same recognition, but Marcus always surpassed him in theoretical understanding. And now it appears Mr. Thorne has decided to claim your brother's work as his own, Holmes said coldly. Mrs. Marchmont, you mentioned a gas company inspector who examined your building last autumn. Describe him in detail. The landlady frowned in concentration. A young man of perhaps 30 years, with dark hair and nervous mannerisms. He spent considerable time examining the vertical pipe runs between floors. Had all the proper documentation, though he seemed unusually interested in the building's history and previous tenants. I suspect inquiry at the gas company will reveal they sent no such inspector, Holmes said grimly. Thorne has been methodically preparing his revenge, studying the building's structure and identifying the optimal placement for his device. A sudden sound from above, a metallic scraping followed by the distinctive crack of rapidly cooling metal, caused us all to freeze. Holmes was moving before any of us could react, taking the stairs 3 at a time with remarkable agility. The corridor outside room 7 had grown noticeably colder, though not with the supernatural chill we had encountered earlier. Holmes pressed his ear to the door, listening intently, then produced his lock picks with practiced efficiency. Someone has been here, he announced, pushing the door open cautiously. The frozen wasteland we had left behind was beginning to thaw, creating a dismal landscape of melting ice and sodden furnishings. But it was not the changed condition of the room that captured our attention. It was the object placed deliberately on the ruined bed. A single black leather glove lay upon the saturated mattress, its surface still bearing a light coating of frost despite the warming air. Holmes approached it with his characteristic caution, using his walking stick to lift it for examination. A message, he murmured, noting a small piece of paper tucked within the glove's wrist. Unfolding it carefully, he read aloud. The demonstration was merely preliminary. The true test of the art requires a more appreciative audience. Those who would steal genius must pay the price of their presumption. He knows we've found Vane, I observed. This is a direct challenge. More than that, Watson. It is a declaration of intent. Holmes studied the note more closely, his expression growing increasingly troubled. The paper is of high quality, watermarked with the seal of the Royal Institution. Thorne intends to make his next demonstration a public one. Vane had followed us upstairs and now stood in the doorway, his face ashen with comprehension. The Royal Institution hosts its winter lecture series this week. tonight's presentation is on advances in industrial refrigeration. Hundreds of London's most prominent scientists and engineers will be in attendance. Holmes checked his pocket watch, his jaw set with grim determination. Then we have perhaps 6 hours to prevent what may be the most audacious scientific murder in the history of criminal enterprise. Mr. Vane, your knowledge of your brother's work is now our most valuable weapon. Can the device be scaled to affect a space as large as the institution's lecture hall? It would require multiple activation points, Vane replied, his voice trembling but resolute. Thorne would need to place catalysts at strategic locations throughout the building, creating what Marcus termed a containment field. The reaction would be instantaneous and absolutely lethal. Holmes moved toward the door with renewed purpose. Then we know what we must look for. Come, Watson, the game has taken a decidedly deadly turn. We must reach the Royal Institution before Julian Thorne transforms London's finest scientific minds into monuments of ice. As we descended the stairs, I could not shake the feeling that we were racing not merely against time, but against the very forces of nature itself, weaponized by a brilliant and utterly ruthless mind. The true test of Holmes's deductive powers was about to begin, and the stakes could not have been higher. The cab bore us swiftly through the crystalline afternoon air toward Albemarle Street. Holmes sitting forward with that peculiar intensity that marked his engagement with a truly challenging case. Beside him, Silas Vane clutched his brother's journal with white-knuckled determination, while I found myself checking my medical bag repeatedly, uncertain what horrors we might encounter. The psychology of our adversary concerns me greatly, Watson, Holmes remarked, his keen eyes fixed on the passing streets. Thorne possesses both the brilliance to perfect this deadly science and the narcissism to crave public demonstration of his superiority. The Royal Institution represents everything he despises: peer review, cautious methodology, the slow advance of accepted knowledge. Surely the building will have adequate security, I ventured. Holmes shook his head grimly. Security guards search for conventional weapons, not glass ampules hidden in ventilation shafts or acoustic triggers disguised as maintenance equipment. We face an enemy who plays by rules only he comprehends. Our arrival at the institution coincided with the early gathering of distinguished guests, their carriages depositing elegantly dressed figures who chatted animatedly about the evening's promised revelations in cryogenic science. None suspected they might be entering a carefully prepared tomb. Holmes's card gained us immediate access to Inspector Lestrade, who had responded to the urgent telegrams with characteristic efficiency. The inspector listened to our explanation with growing alarm, his skepticism battling against hard-earned respect for Holmes's deductive abilities. "You're telling me this Thorne fellow means to freeze a room full of Britain's finest scientific minds using invisible contraptions triggered by sound," Lestrade summarized with barely concealed incredulity. "Not invisible, Inspector. Merely inconspicuous," Holmes corrected. "Mr. Vane, where would such devices achieve maximum effectiveness in a space like the main lecture theatre?" Vane spread his brother's journal across the secretary's desk, pointing to a diagram covered in geometric calculations. Here, and here. 6 positions forming a perfect hexagon around the central space. Marcus discovered that the catalytic reaction requires geometric precision to create what he termed a containment field. Professor Dewar, the evening's lecturer, proved remarkably cooperative once the threat was explained. His expertise in low-temperature physics made him immediately grasp the deadly potential of Marcus Hartwell's weaponized science. The devices would need access to the building's air circulation system, Dewar confirmed, studying the architectural plans. These junction points in the ventilation network would provide optimal distribution for any gaseous catalyst. Holmes divided our forces with military precision. Lestrade's men began a discreet evacuation under the pretense of routine safety inspections, while Holmes and Vane commenced their methodical search of the ventilation system. I coordinated with the institution's staff, creating plausible excuses for guests to depart without triggering panic. The first device was discovered exactly where Vane's calculations predicted, a masterwork of malevolent engineering concealed behind a ventilation grating. Holmes extracted the brass cylinder with infinite care, revealing delicate glass ampoules and a resonance chamber tuned to specific frequencies. "Exquisite craftsmanship," Holmes murmured, examining the trigger mechanism. The slightest vibration at the correct frequency would shatter these seals, mixing catalyst with compressed gas and initiating the cascade reaction. 4 more devices yielded to our systematic search, each discovery confirming the mathematical precision of Thorne's deadly plan. But as the clock approached 6:30 and the 6th device remained elusive, Holmes grew increasingly troubled. "It should be here," Vane insisted, examining the eastern ventilation shaft for the 3rd time. "Without the 6th point, the hexagon remains incomplete, and the cascade cannot achieve full containment." Holmes stood motionless in the corridor, his eyes closed in fierce concentration. When they snapped open, they blazed with sudden fury at having been deceived. "Because there is no 6th device," he declared, his voice tight with realization. "We have been dancing to Thorne's tune while he pursues his true objective elsewhere. This elaborate scheme was never intended to succeed. It was designed to draw us here, away from his actual target." The terrible logic struck me like a physical blow. "Baker Street, Pendleton." "Precisely, Watson. While we chase shadows here, Thorne prepares to eliminate the only witness to his crime in a manner that will appear entirely natural. Another mysterious death in the cursed Room 7. He knows we have Pendleton under our protection, and he means to demonstrate that nowhere is safe from his frozen vengeance." We ran for the street, Holmes shouting for the fastest cab available. As we clattered through the darkening streets toward Baker Street, I could not escape the terrible certainty that Julian Thorne's most audacious gambit was already in motion, and that we were racing not merely against time, but against the very forces of winter itself, weaponized by brilliant malice and directed at the heart of our sanctuary. The game had taken a decidedly personal turn, and the stakes could not have been higher. Our cab raced through the gathering twilight with desperate urgency, the horses' labored breathing creating clouds of vapor that seemed an ominous portent of the weapon we pursued. Holmes sat rigid with controlled tension, his long fingers gripping his walking stick until the knuckles showed white beneath his glove. Every fiber of his being radiated the focused intensity of a predator closing upon its quarry, or perhaps, I realized with growing dread, of prey finally comprehending the true scope of the trap. "Thorne has orchestrated this with diabolical precision, Watson," Holmes said, his voice tight with barely suppressed fury. "The Royal Institution was never his true target. It was an elaborate, theatrical designed specifically for my benefit, calculated to exploit my known weaknesses for intellectual challenge and public demonstration." "Then Pendleton," I began, "is the real demonstration," Holmes finished grimly. "Thorne wishes to prove his mastery over life and death itself, and to strike at the very heart of my sanctuary. He knows that failure to protect those under my care would wound me more deeply than any physical assault." As we turned into Baker Street, the familiar facade of Tooped B appeared deceptively peaceful in the yellow gaslight. Yet even from a distance, Holmes's trained eye detected the subtle signs of catastrophe. A faint, unnatural mist seemed to seep from beneath our front door, pooling on the pavement like spectral fog, and the windows of our sitting room bore the telltale opacity of heavy frost formation. Holmes leapt from the cab before it had fully stopped, his coat billowing behind him as he strode toward our doorway with grim determination. The temperature around the building was noticeably colder than the surrounding street, defying all natural explanation. Mrs. Hudson met us in the hallway, her practical nature asserting itself despite obvious distress. She had wrapped herself in every available shawl and blanket, yet still shivered violently in the unnatural chill that pervaded the lower floors. "Mr. Holmes, thank heavens you've returned," she gasped, her breath forming dense clouds in the frigid air. "It began not 20 minutes ago, a terrible cold that seemed to fall upon the house like a living thing." I was bringing tea to poor Mr. Pendleton when the very stairs turned to ice beneath my feet. I barely managed to retreat to the kitchen. "Pendleton's location?" Holmes demanded sharply. "Your sitting room, sir. He locked himself in when the cold began, said he felt safer behind a solid door." Holmes took the stairs 3 at a time, Vane and myself following close behind. The temperature dropped precipitously with each step, until by the time we reached our landing, the air itself seemed to burn our lungs with its intensity. The door to our chambers was encrusted with thick rime, the brass handle frozen solid and painful to the touch, even through gloves. "Stand clear," Holmes commanded, producing his shoulder against the door with considerable force. The frozen lock mechanism shattered like brittle candy, and we stumbled into what had once been our comfortable sitting room. The transformation was both terrible and magnificent. Every surface gleamed with a coating of ice so thick and uniform that our familiar chambers had become a crystalline palace of death. The fire in the grate was extinguished, the coals frozen into black stones embedded in solid ice. Our books stood like rigid sentinels on their shelves, their leather bindings cracked by the sudden contraction. Most horrifying of all, Arthur Pendleton sat huddled in Holmes's favorite chair, wrapped in blankets that had frozen stiff as boards, his face bearing the blue-white pallor of severe hypothermia. I rushed to his side immediately, my medical training overriding the numbing cold that seeped through my clothing. His pulse was weak and irregular, his breathing shallow and labored, but he lived. "Severe exposure," I announced, beginning gentle manipulation of his extremities to encourage circulation. "We must restore his core temperature gradually, or the shock will kill him as surely as the cold." Holmes, meanwhile, had begun a methodical examination of the room, his keen eyes searching for the source of this supernatural winter. "The device must be here," he muttered, his breath forming dense clouds as he spoke. Thorne would not rely upon external placement for such a precisely targeted attack. Vane stepped forward, tilting his head as if listening to some barely audible sound. "There," he whispered, pointing toward the mantelpiece. "Do you hear it? That low humming, the harmonic resonance of the catalytic reaction." Holmes followed the sound with predatory precision, his trained ear isolating the frequency from the ambient noise of settling ice and creaking wood. The source led him to an unexpected location, the Persian slipper where he kept his tobacco, hanging innocuously beside the fireplace. "Of course," he breathed, a note of grudging admiration in his voice. "Hidden in plain sight, in the one location I would never think to examine during a crisis." He lifted the slipper carefully, dumping its contents onto the frozen floor. Nestled in the toe, gleaming with malevolent purpose, was a brass cylinder identical to those we had discovered at the Royal Institution, but smaller and more refined. "Don't touch the activation chamber," Vane warned urgently. "The cascade reaction is self-sustaining now. Any vibration could accelerate the thermal drop beyond our ability to counteract it." Holmes studied the device with intense concentration, his mind racing through possibilities. "Then how do we interrupt the process?" "Multiple approaches," Vane replied, his scientific training asserting itself despite the mortal danger. "The reaction requires 3 elements to maintain itself: continuous catalytic flow, harmonic resonance, and thermal equilibrium. If we can disrupt any one of these—" Holmes's eyes blazed with sudden understanding. He moved swiftly to the gas fixture on the wall, examining the brass fittings with minute care. "Here, tool marks, recently made. Thorne has modified our gas supply to feed his infernal device." He turned to me sharply. "Watson, the main gas valve in the scullery. Shut it off immediately." I descended the stairs at breakneck speed, nearly colliding with Mrs. Hudson in the passage. In the dim light of the scullery, I found the brass valve that controlled our gas supply and wrenched it closed with all my strength. The faint hissing that had been barely audible ceased abruptly. When I returned, Holmes had retrieved his violin from its case. Miraculously, the wood had not yet cracked from the extreme cold. "The harmonic frequency," he explained, tucking the instrument under his chin. "If we can generate a precise countertone, we should be able to disrupt the acoustic resonance that maintains the reaction." "High pitch," Vane instructed, his voice tight with concentration. "As high and pure as you can generate. We must shatter the standing wave pattern." Holmes drew the bow across the strings with controlled violence, producing a piercing, discordant shriek that set our teeth on edge. This was not music, but weaponized physics. Pure sound transformed into a tool of survival. The brass cylinder began to vibrate visibly, its internal mechanisms fighting against the acoustic assault. "The thermal component," Holmes called over the violin scream. "Watson, the poker from the fire. We need direct thermal shock to complete the disruption." I seized the iron implement from beside the cold grate. Though the fire was extinguished, the poker retained considerable heat from its proximity to the coals before the temperature drop. Moving carefully to avoid disturbing Holmes's precise bowing, I positioned the glowing metal directly above the device. "Now!" Vane shouted, and I drove the poker downward with all my strength. The combined assault, acoustic, thermal, and chemical, proved devastatingly effective. The device emitted a sound like shattering crystal. The brass casing cracked under the thermal stress, and a final geyser of supercooled vapor erupted upward before the reaction collapsed entirely. The oppressive weight of the unnatural cold began to lift immediately, replaced by the merely uncomfortable chill of a winter room without fire. Holmes lowered his violin, his breathing heavy from exertion and cold. The silence that followed seemed almost deafening after the acoustic battle we had just waged. "Brilliant synthesis," Vane whispered, examining the ruined device with a mixture of scientific fascination and moral horror. Marcus himself could never have conceived such a comprehensive countermeasure. I returned to Pendleton, who was beginning to show signs of recovery as warmth slowly returned to the room. His color was improving, and his breathing had become more regular, though he would require careful monitoring for several hours. Holmes moved to the window, scraping away a patch of frost to peer down at the street below. His expression hardened into a look of predatory resolve. "He's watching," Holmes announced quietly. "The hansom cab across the street. It has remained stationary for far too long, and the driver sits with unnatural stillness. Thorne wishes to observe the results of his handiwork." "Then he knows his device has failed," I observed. "Indeed. And a desperate genius is the most dangerous adversary of all." Holmes turned from the window, his eyes blazing with cold fury. "But he has made one critical error, Watson. In making this personal, in striking at the heart of my sanctuary, he has revealed the true depth of his obsession, and obsessed men, however brilliant, inevitably fall victim to the very patterns that drive them." As if summoned by his words, Mrs. Hudson appeared in the doorway with blankets and hot tea, her practical nature reasserting itself now that the immediate danger had passed. "Will the gentleman be all right, Dr. Watson?" she inquired, nodding toward Pendleton. "He will recover," I assured her, "though it will take time and careful nursing." Holmes had already moved to his desk, withdrawing paper and pen with swift, decisive movements. "Mr. Vane, your knowledge of your brother's work has been invaluable, but our association must now take a more active turn. Julian Thorne believes he has demonstrated his superiority, that he has proven himself master of this deadly game. It is time we taught him the fatal error of that assumption." As Holmes sealed his letter and dispatched it with urgent instructions, I understood that we had entered the final phase of this extraordinary case. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and the brilliant, twisted mind of Julian Thorne would soon face the full force of Sherlock, Holmes's relentless pursuit of justice. The game, as my friend was fond of saying, was indeed afoot, but now the rules had changed entirely, and the stakes could not have been higher. The morning light filtering through our frost-damaged windows found Holmes in a state of intense cerebral activity, his long frame stretched upon the sofa in that characteristic pose which indicated the most vigorous mental exertion. He had spoken little since our triumph over Thorn's infernal device, yet I could observe the rapid movement of his eyes and the occasional gesture of his hands that suggested his remarkable mind was arranging and rearranging the facts of our case into new and more comprehensive patterns. "Watson," he said suddenly, rising with that explosive energy which always marked the transition from contemplation to action, "we have won a battle, but the war remains far from concluded. Thorn's assault upon Baker Street was not merely an attempt at murder. It was a reconnaissance in force, designed to test both our defenses and our understanding of his capabilities." I set down my medical journal, noting the grim satisfaction in my friend's voice. "You believe he will strike again?" "I'm certain of it. Consider his psychology, my dear fellow. Julian Thorn is not merely a criminal. He is an artist of destruction, and like all artists, he craves an audience for his masterpiece. Last night's demonstration was merely the overture to a far grander performance." Mrs. Hudson appeared with our breakfast, her practical nature asserting itself despite the previous evening's supernatural terrors. "Will you gentlemen be requiring anything special today?" she inquired, though I detected a slight tremor in her voice that spoke to the lingering effects of our ordeal. Holmes accepted his coffee with a distracted nod, his attention already focused upon the morning papers spread across his desk. "Mrs. Hudson, you mentioned yesterday that several of your neighbors have complained of unusual cold in their rooms. Might I trouble you for the specific addresses?" "Certainly, Mr. Holmes. Mrs. Pemberton at number 219 mentioned her parlor turned quite frigid Tuesday last, though the weather was mild. And Mr. Ashford at 225 found ice upon his windowsills Wednesday morning, despite his fire burning brightly through the night." Holmes's eyes blazed with sudden understanding. "Of course. Watson, observe the pattern. 219, 221B, 225. Thorn has been conducting systematic experiments upon our entire street, testing the range and precision of his apparatus. We have been living within his laboratory without realizing it. The implications struck me with considerable force. Then he has been watching us for weeks, perhaps months, perfecting his technique." "Precisely. And now that he knows we understand his methods, he faces a critical decision: flee London entirely or attempt one final, definitive demonstration that will cement his reputation as the master of this deadly science." Holmes moved to the window, his keen gaze scanning the street below with predatory intensity. "His vanity will not permit retreat, Watson. He must prove his superiority, not merely to us, but to the world at large." A knock at our door interrupted his analysis. Lestrade entered, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had spent a sleepless night grappling with phenomena that defied his considerable experience in criminal matters. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, "my men have been making inquiries throughout the night. Julian Thorn has not returned to any of his known lodgings, and his former colleagues at the Cryogenic Research Foundation report that considerable quantities of specialized equipment have gone missing from their laboratories." "What manner of equipment?" Holmes inquired sharply. "Compression chambers, precision valves, and what they described as exotic catalytic compounds. Materials worth several £1,000s and requiring expert knowledge to employ safely." Holmes struck his hands together with satisfaction. "Then our timeline has accelerated considerably. Thorn is preparing for his magnum opus, a demonstration so spectacular and deadly that it will establish his name in the annals of criminal history forever." Silas Vane arrived within the hour, his face bearing the haggard expression of a man who had spent the night wrestling with terrible possibilities. He carried with him additional pages from his brother's journal, documents he had previously withheld due to their disturbing implications. "I feared to share these earlier," he explained, spreading the yellowed papers across Holmes's desk. "They detail Marcus's theoretical work on what he termed cascade amplification, the possibility of linking multiple devices to create effects far beyond the capacity of any single apparatus." Holmes studied the diagrams with intense concentration, his trained mind immediately grasping the mathematical relationships that governed this deadly science. "The geometric progressions are extraordinary," he murmured. 6 devices arranged in a hexagonal pattern could theoretically freeze an area encompassing several city blocks. "The calculations suggest even greater potential," Vane replied grimly. "With sufficient preparation and the proper catalytic materials, the effect could theoretically encompass—" He paused, unable to complete the thought. "The entire metropolis," Holmes finished quietly. "Thorne does not merely seek to commit murder, gentlemen. He aspires to become the architect of London's destruction." The weight of this revelation settled upon us like a physical presence. We were no longer dealing with a brilliant criminal seeking personal revenge, but with a man whose ambitions had expanded to encompass catastrophe on an unprecedented scale. Holmes began pacing with renewed vigor, his analytical mind already formulating countermeasures. The question becomes not whether Thorne will attempt such a demonstration, but where and when. He requires a location that satisfies both his practical needs and his theatrical sensibilities. Somewhere that will provide maximum symbolic impact while offering the infrastructure necessary for his apparatus. "The Royal Institution," I suggested. "Too small for his enlarged ambitions and too well guarded after yesterday's false alarm." Holmes paused before his map of London, his finger tracing potential locations. "No, he requires something grander, more public, a stage worthy of what he believes will be his greatest triumph." Lestrade cleared his throat. "There's something else, Mr. Holmes. The Metropolitan Police received an anonymous message this morning, delivered by a street urchin who claimed a well-dressed gentleman gave him 6pence to carry it to Scotland Yard. He produced a folded paper of expensive quality, its contents written in an educated hand. Holmes read aloud, "To the esteemed representatives of law and order. Tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock, the citizens of London will witness a demonstration of scientific achievement that will revolutionize human understanding of the natural world. Those with the wisdom to appreciate true genius are invited to observe from a safe distance. The location will become apparent to all when the performance begins." "Signed with a simple T," Holmes noted, examining the paper's watermark. "Expensive stationery, available only from a few select establishments. The arrogance is breathtaking. He actually expects to have spectators for his act of mass destruction." "Tomorrow evening," I repeated. "That provides us with less than 30 hours to identify his target and devise countermeasures." Holmes folded the message carefully, his expression settling into that mask of cold determination I had learned to associate with his most dangerous moods. "Then we must think as Thorne thinks, anticipate his choices before he makes them. Mr. Vane, your brother's journal. Does it contain any references to locations Marcus considered ideal for large-scale experiments?" Vane consulted the yellowed pages with growing excitement. "Yes, here. Notes about the importance of elevation for optimal gas dispersion, access to high-pressure supply lines, and—" He paused, his face paling. "Acoustic resonance chambers that could amplify the harmonic triggers across great distances." "Acoustic resonance," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "Watson, what structures in London possess exceptional acoustic properties?" The answer struck me with the force of revelation. The Albert Hall, its dome creates perfect sound amplification, and the building sits at one of the highest points in South Kensington. Holmes's eyes blazed with fierce satisfaction. "Brilliant, Watson. And tomorrow evening, the hall hosts its annual Winter Gala, a gathering of London's most prominent citizens, including members of Parliament, the Royal Society, and representatives of every major scientific institution in the Empire." "The perfect audience for Thorne's final performance," Lestrade observed grimly. Holmes moved to his desk and began composing urgent telegrams with swift, decisive strokes. "Inspector, I require every available man positioned around the Albert Hall, but they must remain invisible. Any obvious police presence will drive Thorne to ground. Mr. Vane, your expertise in your brother's work will be essential to identifying and neutralizing whatever devices Thorne has installed." "And you, Holmes?" I inquired. though I suspected I already knew the answer. His smile was sharp as a blade. I, my dear Watson, shall attend the winter gala as an invited guest. If Julian Thorne wishes to stage his masterpiece before an appreciative audience, then he shall have one, but perhaps not quite the reception he anticipates. As our preparations commenced in earnest, I could not escape the feeling that we were approaching the climax of this extraordinary case. A confrontation between two brilliant minds, one dedicated to the preservation of life and the other to its systematic destruction. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, had never been more deadly, and the stakes could not have been higher. The fate of London itself hung in the balance, suspended between the genius of Sherlock Holmes and the malevolent brilliance of Julian Thorne. Tomorrow evening would determine which would prove the stronger, the forces of order and justice, or the cold mathematics of engineered destruction. The Albert Hall rose against the winter sky like a vast crimson drum, its distinctive dome catching the gaslight from hundreds of carriages depositing London's elite at its grand entrance. Holmes had positioned himself strategically in the royal box, his evening dress impeccable, but his keen eyes scanning not the glittering assembly, but the architectural details that could harbor death itself. From my position among the medical staff, I observed the subtle signals passing between Holmes and our scattered allies. Lestrade's men were invisible among the crowd, while Silas Vane worked desperately in the building's mechanical spaces below, his knowledge of his brother's deadly science our only guide through this labyrinth of potential catastrophe. The evening's musical program commenced with stirring precision, the orchestra's opening notes swelling through the hall's perfect acoustics. Yet Holmes remained rigid with tension, his fingers drumming silently against the velvet armrest in calculations I could not fathom. 20 minutes into the performance, Holmes rose abruptly and made his way toward the service corridors with purposeful stride. I followed, abandoning my medical station to join him in the dimly lit passages that honeycombed the great building's foundations. "The organ, Watson," Holmes announced grimly as we descended into the mechanical depths. "Not merely an instrument, but the heart of Thorne's weapon. Every pipe connects to the building's ventilation system, every note capable of triggering harmonic resonance throughout the structure." We found Vane crouched beside a massive brass cylinder attached to the main air intake, his face pale with scientific horror. "5 devices discovered," he reported tersely. "But the 6th, the crucial apex of his geometric pattern, remains hidden." Holmes examined the apparatus with his magnifying lens, noting the sophisticated timing mechanisms and glass ampules filled with swirling, opalescent catalyst. "He has built redundancies into every system. Even if we neutralize these devices, the primary trigger remains active." A slow, deliberate clapping echoed from the shadows ahead. Julian Thorne emerged from behind a massive steam pipe, his tall frame unmistakable despite the maintenance clothing, his gloved hands steady as he leveled a revolver at Holmes's chest. "Magnificent deduction, Mr. Holmes," Thorne said, his cultured voice carrying clearly in the confined space. "Though you arrived too late to prevent the demonstration, above us the orchestra approaches the finale, Bach's toccata and fugue, with its gloriously powerful bass notes. The resonance will propagate through every pipe, activating the cascade reaction in perfect geometric harmony. Your brother's work was meant to benefit humanity." Vane stepped forward, his voice shaking with grief and rage. "You have perverted it into an instrument of mass murder." Thorne's expression hardened. Marcus lacked vision. He saw only the crude applications: refrigeration, preservation. "I've revealed the true artistry of controlled thermal destruction. When the temperature drops, chaos gives way to perfect crystalline order." Holmes had been edging slowly toward a cluster of steam valves, his movements barely perceptible. "Tell me, Thorne, have you calculated the cascade propagation beyond this building? The thermal disruption will not confine itself to your intended victims." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Thorne's features. "The containment field is theoretical at this scale," Holmes interrupted sharply. "Your device will transform half of London into an Arctic wasteland." The distant thunder of the organ's opening bass notes began to vibrate through the building's structure, each note deeper and more powerful than the last. Thorne smiled with fanatic satisfaction, his finger tightening on the revolver's trigger. "The performance reaches its climax, gentlemen. Observe the supremacy of pure intellect over biological chaos." Holmes struck with lightning precision, not at Thorne, but at the steam valve directly above the villain's head. The pipe burst with explosive force, engulfing Thorne in a scalding white cloud. His scream was drowned by the roar of superheated steam as he collapsed, the revolver clattering harmlessly away. But even as Lestrade's men surged forward to secure the fallen madman, a deep, ominous humming began to shake the building's foundations. The organ's bass notes had triggered the harmonic resonance in the remaining devices. "The counter-frequency!" Vane shouted over the growing mechanical thunder. "We must reach the organ console." We raced through service corridors as the temperature plummeted around us, frost forming on the walls with supernatural speed. The great hall's confused murmur rose to panic as the audience sensed the building's distress. Holmes burst into the organ loft, shoving aside the bewildered musician. His long fingers found the highest register keys, pulling every treble stop with desperate precision. The piercing countertone that erupted cut through the building's deadly resonance like a blade, disrupting the harmonic pattern that fed Thorne's cascade reaction. For a terrifying moment, the two frequencies battled for supremacy. Then, with a sound like crystal shattering, the deadly humming ceased entirely. Holmes slumped over the keys, exhausted but triumphant. "It is finished, Watson. The cascade is broken." As confusion in the great hall gave way to relieved murmurs, I knew we had witnessed Holmes's greatest victory, not merely solving a crime, but outmaneuvering death itself through pure scientific reasoning and unshakable courage. The aftermath of that extraordinary evening at the Albert Hall unfolded with the methodical precision that characterized all of Holmes's endeavors. Yet beneath the surface, efficiency lay currents of profound relief that we had narrowly averted catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. Julian Thorne, severely burned but alive, was conveyed under heavy guard to the secure ward at Newgate Prison, where he would face charges of attempted murder that defied conventional legal precedent. The elaborate apparatus scattered throughout the building's infrastructure was carefully dismantled under Silas Vane's expert supervision, each component catalogued as evidence of the most audacious scientific crime in modern history. 3 days later, I found myself once again in our restored sitting room at Baker Street, where Mrs. Hudson's determined efforts had erased most traces of Thorne's assault upon our sanctuary. Holmes sat in his customary chair, smoking his pipe and gazing into the fire with that distant expression which indicated he was reviewing the entire case from beginning to end, ensuring no detail had escaped his comprehensive analysis. Arthur Pendleton had called that afternoon to express his gratitude, his recovery, complete though his perspective forever altered by his brush with unnatural death. "I owe you my life, Mr. Holmes," he said earnestly, accepting the brandy I offered. "Not only mine, but the lives of hundreds who would have perished but for your intervention." Holmes waved away the praise with characteristic dismissal, though I detected satisfaction in his expression. "The credit belongs equally to our allies, Watson. Mr. Vane's knowledge of his brother's work, your steady presence, even Lestrade's efficient coordination. This case reminded me that even the most solitary intellect requires collaboration when confronting threats of such magnitude." "Now then," I said, settling into my chair with renewed curiosity, "you have promised us a complete explanation of this remarkable case. We have seen the fragments, the frozen rooms, the cascade devices, the acoustic triggers. Show us the complete design." Holmes set down his pipe and steepled his fingers, his keen eyes reflecting the firelight. "Very well. Let us begin with Edmund Carstairs, 8 years ago, a quiet clerk who died in a room transformed into an Arctic wasteland. The phenomenon was attributed to unusual weather and a weak heart, but in reality, it represented the first crude trial of Marcus Hartwell's cascade refrigeration, a scientific curiosity with monstrous potential. Vane, who had remained in London to assist with the technical analysis, shifted uncomfortably. Marcus never intended harm, Mr. Holmes. The Carstairs incident was an accident that destroyed him with guilt. Indeed, Holmes agreed gently. But that tragedy was observed by a more ruthless mind. Julian Thorne coveted Marcus's fellowship, his recognition, his breakthrough discovery. When Marcus fled in remorse, Thorne saw only opportunity. He acquired the missing pages of the journal, whether by theft or coercion matters little, and spent years perfecting what Marcus had created as an industrial tool into a weapon of selective murder. Holmes rose and moved to our Persian slipper, now drying by the fire after its recent misuse as a concealment device. His methodology was elegant in its simplicity. The cascade reaction required 3 elements: compressed catalytic compounds, harmonic resonance at specific frequencies, and precise geometric placement. Thorne's genius lay in miniaturizing the apparatus while maximizing its deadly efficiency. The boarding house incidents, I prompted. His testing ground, Holmes confirmed. Strange chills reported in various rooms. Enough to perfect range, timing, and placement without arousing official suspicion. When Mr. Pendleton took the old cursed room, Thorne decided to recreate the Carstairs incident as both demonstration and message. What manner of message? Pendleton asked, though I suspected he already knew. That there existed in London a man who could transform any locked room into a tomb of ice, Holmes replied, his voice growing cold with controlled anger. And that this man wished to engage my personal attention. You see, Thorne had studied my methods, quoted my monographs. His brilliance was poisoned by resentment that his name lacked my notoriety. Holmes began pacing with renewed energy. His masquerade as a gas inspector allowed him to modify the building's infrastructure, creating pathways for his apparatus. The attack on Mr. Vane's room served dual purposes: testing his enhanced devices while establishing a convenient scapegoat should his experiments be detected prematurely. The assault on Baker Street, I said, was personal. Utterly so. By concealing his device in my own tobacco slipper and timing its activation to the bells of London itself, Thorne demonstrated both his contempt for my methods and his confidence in his own superiority. Holmes's eyes blazed with the memory. But vanity was his undoing, Watson. The Royal Institution gambit was masterful misdirection, yet it revealed his fatal flaw, the need for a grand audience. The Albert Hall, Vane murmured. Marcus had speculated about using existing acoustic structures to amplify the cascade effect. Precisely. Thorne saw in the hall's dome and organ pipes the perfect marriage of symbolism and infrastructure. The organ became both trigger and distribution network, capable of creating what he termed a frozen corona, encompassing much of South Kensington. Holmes paused, his expression growing grim. Had his calculations proven correct, the cascade reaction might have spread throughout much of London. Yet you defeated it, Pendleton observed. Holmes smiled thinly. By turning his own weapon against itself. The same pipes that could generate precise harmonic frequencies could also produce disruptive countertones. When I seized the keyboard and flooded the system with dissonant overtones, his carefully tuned apparatus found itself in a war it could not win. Inspector Lestrade arrived as evening deepened, bringing news that Thorne, under heavy guard at the hospital, had retreated into sullen silence. The Crown Prosecutor believes transportation is the minimum sentence, Lestrade reported, with hanging a distinct possibility given the scale of his ambitions. After our visitors departed, Holmes reached for his violin, drawing the bow across the strings with unusual gentleness. The melody that emerged was melancholy, yet somehow triumphant, a musical reflection on the case's strange mixture of horror and resolution. "You know, Watson," he said between phrases, There exists a peculiar satisfaction in cases such as this. Not merely the intellectual challenge, though that was considerable, but the knowledge that scientific reason, properly applied, can counter even the most perverse applications of human ingenuity. You believe reason will always triumph over malevolence? Not always, my friend, but often enough to justify the struggle. He set down the violin and fixed me with that penetrating gaze. The criminal classes grow more sophisticated with each passing year, their methods increasingly informed by scientific advancement. Yet for every Julian Thorne who seeks to weaponize knowledge, there must exist individuals willing to dedicate their intellect to protection rather than destruction. As the fire crackled in the grate and London's familiar sounds filtered through our restored windows, I reflected on the extraordinary events we had witnessed. We had confronted forces that seemed to mock the very laws of nature, yet through Holmes's remarkable deductive abilities and the combined efforts of dedicated allies, we had emerged victorious. "Come, Watson," Holmes said at last, reaching, for want of sounder tobacco storage, into my medical bag for a pinch of shag. "The barometer suggests clear weather, and I detect in the newspapers a disturbing lack of intellectual stimulation. Let us hope that somewhere in this vast, untidy city, a problem worthy of our attention is preparing its entrance." He paused, his hand resting thoughtfully on the mantelpiece where Thorne's device had once hummed with deadly purpose. Though I confess, I should be quite content if the next case to cross our threshold involved nothing more lethal than a missing umbrella and a mislaid hat box. However, experience suggests that London is unlikely to oblige. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, would continue. New challenges would arise. New threats would emerge from the shadows. But on this particular evening, with the warmth of our sanctuary restored and the knowledge of catastrophe averted, I allowed myself the luxury of simple gratitude for my friend's unique genius and the privilege of standing beside him in the eternal struggle between order and chaos. Outside our windows, London glittered with reassuring warmth, its lights twinkling like stars against the winter darkness. The icebound lodger had been defeated, his frozen legacy consigned to the evidence rooms of Scotland Yard. Yet somewhere in the city's vast complexity, I knew with certainty that new mysteries were already taking shape, waiting for the keen intellect and unwavering courage of Sherlock Holmes to bring them into the light.